60 million years before the Imperium of Man drew its first breath, a king named Szarekh walked out of a furnace and looked at what remained of his civilization. The lore records what he saw with terrible precision. Where there had been a civilization of living, breathing, feeling beings, there were hollow shells of living metal, the architecture of consciousness without anyone home inside it. Szarekh felt an emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment, he knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. He'd agreed to give his people everything they'd ever wanted. What he'd actually given away was everything that made them people. This is where most accounts of the Necrons begin, at the transformation, the flesh-to-metal moment that produced the galaxy's most feared undying army. Games Workshop's own official text describes the Necrontyr, the biological species the Necrons once were, as a short-lived and spiteful species racked by disease, cursed by the cruelty of an uncaring galaxy. Their souls, the official record confirms, were stolen by the C'tan in a wicked deception. The Necrons are the monsters of this history. Ask anyone in the 41st millennium who recognizes the name. The problem with that verdict is the evidence. The war in heaven, fought over 60 million years before the current setting, is the foundational conflict of this universe, the war that shaped every faction, every horror, every existential catastrophe the 41st millennium currently endures. Follow the chain of decisions back past the Necrons' transformation, past the war itself, all the way back to the first act that made all of it inevitable, and you find a different origin point. You find a choice made by the beings history treats as the victims. You find the moment, the old ones, immortal, godlike, the galaxy's first great civilization, were asked for help by a dying species and refused. The Necrons fought a war they were forced into, were deceived by beings far older and more cunning than themselves, paid a price that staggers comprehension, and eventually destroyed those who betrayed them. Meanwhile, the galaxy's true architects of catastrophe left behind a legacy that is still actively killing people 60 million years later. That is the argument. Every piece of it follows from the evidence. Begin with the Necrontyr, before anyone had wronged anyone, before the war, before the deal, before the furnaces. Begin with what they were. The Necrontyr's homeworld was barren and radiation blasted, making it incredibly hostile to life. Their star wasn't simply harsh, it actively consumed them, saturating their world with radiation that drove their biology toward constant cellular breakdown. Their bodies were ridden with radiation sickness from birth. The cancers that plagued them weren't metaphorical. Physical cancers consumed their bodies with a consistency and ferocity that no medical technology the Necrontyr developed could fully overcome. And they developed considerable medical technology because they needed it desperately across every generation of their history. Leaving didn't fix it. The Necrontyr were technologically capable of interstellar travel. They built an empire spanning multiple star systems, and the radiation damage followed them across the void. Their biology had evolved to endure their star's punishment up to reproductive age, which meant the short lifespan was written into their genetic architecture. Crossing to a different star system didn't rewrite that code. Generations born under different suns died at the same ages their ancestors had, carrying cellular damage from a world they'd never seen. The affliction wasn't environmental in any way they could simply leave behind. It was encoded in them. The Necrontyr were, by any external measure, a genuinely impressive civilization. Advanced enough for interstellar travel, empire building, and sciences sophisticated enough to eventually attract the attention of some of the most powerful entities in the known galaxy. Their suffering wasn't a failure of intelligence or ambition. It was simply a condition they couldn't cure, and they'd been trying, with everything they had, the entire time. Picture what that civilization looks like from the inside. Every Necrontyr city was constructed in anticipation of its inhabitants' early deaths. The living were brief residents, scratching out their daily existences in the shadow of vast sepulchres and tombs of their ancestors. The greatest monuments were always built for the dead, never the living. Their most powerful cultural and religious movements were mortuary cults, not fringe beliefs, but the organizing spiritual principle of a society that had never known a generation that didn't bury most of its members too young. Their most celebrated artisans devoted careers to crafting elaborate tombs. Their scientists poured their efforts into preserving consciousness beyond physical death, because the question of what happened when the body failed wasn't philosophy for the Necrontyr. It was the central, practical problem their civilization had never managed to solve. The rage that would eventually drive them to war didn't emerge from cruelty or ambition. It grew from centuries of watching everyone you knew die before they were done living, and understanding that this wasn't an accident of nature, but a solvable problem that no one with the solution had chosen to solve. The Empire's politics reflected all of this. The Triarch, a ruling council of 3 pharaohs governing all Necrontyr dynasties, with Szarekh as the supreme silent king, couldn't hold the competing power structures together. The wars of secession had torn the Empire apart from within long before the Necrontyr ever made contact with any other species. A dying people is also a people in a hurry, and hurried civilizations don't build stable political institutions easily. The dynasties were fracturing so severely that Szarekh needed something to unify them, or the empire would collapse into civil war before any external threat could touch it. Lore records this explicitly. The Triarch needed a singular foe to unite the fractured dynasties. Szarekh's eventual decision to go to war carried a political calculation alongside a moral one, and that complexity is worth acknowledging. It doesn't change what preceded the war or what was done to his people during it. The Necrontyr encountered the Old Ones and understood immediately what they were looking at. The Old Ones were among the earliest sentient species in the galaxy's history to harness the power of the warp, the psychic dimension that runs parallel to real space, reflecting and amplifying the emotional states of conscious beings. Their mastery of it was absolute. They had built the webway, the transdimensional network of tunnels threading through dimensions adjacent to both real space and the immaterium, which allowed instant travel across galactic distances while bypassing the warp's dangers entirely. This wasn't incidental engineering. It was the greatest feat of dimensional architecture in galactic history, produced by beings who existed simultaneously in the warp and real space and understood both with a clarity no other species had achieved. They had used that mastery to seed and shape life across the galaxy for longer than most civilizations had existed. By the time the Necrontyr encountered them, the Old Ones had been the galaxy's dominant intelligence for so long that the concept of patience most beings understand barely applies to them. They were, by every useful definition, gods, and they've been operating at that level for so long that the mortality of shorter-lived species registered to them the way seasons register to a mountain. The Necrontyr, dying one generation at a time, came to these beings with a petition: share the secret of eternal life. The Old Ones refused. That is the entire transaction. The canonical sources don't record what argument they made, or whether they made one at all. Multiple interpretations exist: that they considered the Necrontyr morally unworthy, that they feared the consequences of an immortal Necrontyr civilization, that immortal beings simply moved at a pace incompatible with a species running out of time while they deliberated, discussing the matter with the patience of creatures who had millennia to decide while Necrontyr died waiting for an answer. The canon is silent on their reasoning. That silence is itself a statement. The refusal was a choice. That much is confirmed in the canonical record. The Old Ones had conquered the secrets of immortality. They had the capacity to share it, and they declined to act. A civilization that had spent its existence deciding which species would flourish, that had, in fact, engineered and cultivated life across the galaxy according to its own criteria, looked at the Necrontyr and decided their suffering would continue. The cancer would keep killing. The tombs would keep filling. The dynasties would keep fracturing. The Old Ones had somewhere else to be. The Triarch declared war. The Necrontyr turned their entire civilization toward the conflict, for both of the reasons Szarekh had. the existential fury at what the refusal meant, and the political necessity of a unified enemy to prevent the Empire's internal collapse. What followed was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. The Old Ones' mastery of the webway gave them a strategic advantage that conventional military capability couldn't overcome. They could reinforce any position instantly, attack from any direction, and withdraw through dimensional passages the Necrontyr couldn't follow or even locate. A civilization fighting through real space against an enemy that moves through hidden dimensional tunnels doesn't fight a war so much as stand in one place being struck from every angle. The Necrontyr lost badly. The Triarch sought desperately for anything that could reverse the collapse. That desperation is the exact condition the C'tan had been waiting for. The C'tan were ancient beyond any other reckoning in the galaxy. Beings of pure energy, they had existed since the universe's earliest ages, feeding on the nuclear reactions of dying stars. Each of them had consumed stellar furnaces for longer than the Necrontyr civilization had existed. The Nightbringer, among the most terrible, had been feeding on the energy of the Necrontyr homeworld's own star, the same star whose radiation had been consuming the Necrontyr from birth. There is commentary suggesting that the Nightbringer's presence had made that star more hostile, that the Necrontyr's suffering wasn't purely cosmic bad luck, but a byproduct of sharing a solar system with an entity that fed on stellar fire. This connection isn't confirmed with certainty in the canonical record, but it shapes the full picture. The beings who would offer the Necrontyr salvation from a radiation curse may have been feeding on the source of that curse all along. The C'tan's interest in the Necrontyr went beyond geography. Stars run out. Conscious beings don't, or not as quickly. And the psychic and life energy of a sentient species was considerably more nourishing than diffuse stellar radiation. The C'tan needed a different food source. The Necrontyr, racked by a losing war and the accumulated desperation of an entire civilization's history, were available. The Deceiver, known in lore as Mephetron, described as the trickster who goes by many names, was the C'tan who made contact. Lore records that the Deceiver had been working his influence on the Necrontyr long before the formal proposition, using his words to instill hatred of the Old One's power and ageless wisdom, meaning some portion of the rage that had driven the declaration of war was itself a product of C'tan manipulation. The Necrontyr hadn't simply encountered the C'tan at their moment of maximum vulnerability. The C'tan had been quietly manufacturing that vulnerability from the beginning. The Deceiver then stepped forward with his offer: immortal bodies of living metal called necrodermis, into which the Necrontyr's consciousnesses would be transferred whole. No more radiation damage, no more early death. The secret of eternal life, without the complication of having to defeat the Old Ones to claim it. There was a warning. Orican the Diviner, the Triarch's court astrologer, ran his calculations and issued a confirmed prophecy. The alliance would bring about a renaissance of glory, but destroy forever the soul of the Necrontyr people. This is documented in the lore. Orican said it directly. Szarekh and the Triarch dismissed it. A Necrontyr year after the Deceiver had presented his proposition, the Triarch agreed to the alliance, and so forever doomed their species. Those words, that specific framing, come directly from the canonical record. What followed is described in Games Workshop's own official text as a nightmare time. The entire Necrontyr race was put to vast furnaces, their flesh burned away to be replaced with cold, unfeeling metal. The process wasn't a careful, consensual transfer of consciousness into a waiting vessel. It was an industrial operation conducted at civilizational scale. Necrontyr lined up in front of gigantic processing plants and pushed through willingly or unwillingly, some going by choice because they trusted their Triarch, others forcibly rounded up by prowling ghost arcs when they tried to refuse. The official text confirms both scenarios occurred. Either way, the outcome was identical. The C'tan feasted on the life energies of the entire Necrontyr race, even as the transfers were made, leaving behind only the ghostly echoes of the consciousnesses that had existed. Every Necrontyr soul was consumed. What emerged from the furnaces was what the lore describes as cold, unfeeling automatons. Only a few of the strongest-willed individuals retained their intellect and self-awareness, and even they were shadows of their former selves. The hierarchy was preserved in the most cynical way possible. Low-level citizens were robbed of any individuality or feeling. The professional warrior class retained just enough independence to fight effectively, and the overlords and cryptechs maintained their sentience, but were bound by engrammatic command protocols that enslaved them to Szarekh, who was himself bound to the Catan above him. A chain of control dressed up as the salvation of a people. What was lost deserves a direct accounting, because history tends to smooth over it. The Necrons got immortal bodies, exactly as promised. What they didn't get, and what nobody had fully communicated before the irreversible process completed, was everything that made life worth inhabiting. Memories, stripped. Sensation, warmth, cold, hunger, pleasure, pain, gone. Emotion, empathy, the sense of self that makes a consciousness more than a running process, hollowed out. Individual identity, in most cases, erased entirely, leaving operational units where people had been. The Necrons are joyless in their immortality. They couldn't enjoy what they'd survived to possess. Some couldn't even clearly recall why they'd wanted it. When Szarekh emerged from the process, looked at his people, and understood the awful truth, the lore records his immediate interior state with a specificity that's unusual for events 60 million years removed. The terrible emptiness gnawing at his mind, the inexpressible hollowness of spirit, the cold certainty. He'd made the bargain. He'd accepted the terms. He'd delivered his entire civilization to the processing plants. Szarekh is characterized in the lore as driven by profound guilt over biotransference, and his primary goal, confirmed in his modern characterization, is to reverse it, to find a way to return to his people what the Catan consumed. That goal has persisted across 60 million years. That isn't the priority of a conqueror satisfied with his victories. It's the penance of a king who understood, standing outside a furnace on the worst day in his civilization's history, exactly what he had agreed to. Now the Necrons, immortal and powered by the Catan, turned the war around. The old ones, facing defeat, reached for the same tool they'd always used: biology. In the conflict that followed, the old ones created and modified a succession of new species to fight the Necron and Catan threat. The Eldari weren't a natural evolution. They were designed from the ground up, their brains and bodies shaped to maximize psychic potential, because psychic power was the one domain in which the Catan, beings of pure material realm energy, could be effectively challenged. The Old Ones invested the Eldari with psychic sensitivity far exceeding anything that had evolved naturally anywhere in the galaxy, then sheltered them in the webway, the same dimensional infrastructure withheld from the Necrontyr, until they were ready to be deployed. Even the gods the Eldari would eventually worship were, in their origins, purpose-built weapons. Warp beings cultivated in the psychic dimension as the Eldari fought, evolving from sentient constructs into what the Imperium would record as its first true gods. But weapons first, deities second, a detail the Eldari's later theology would find uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Krork came alongside them, massive, biologically optimized for combat, built to know war and essentially nothing else. These were the ancestors of the Orcs, and the Old Ones built them with the same thoroughness they applied to everything. The Krork were exactly as capable as the war required them to be. The problem was that the Old Ones apparently hadn't designed an off switch. The Krork had been engineered exclusively for fighting, with no meaningful purpose encoded for the period after the conflict that defined their existence ended. The Jokaro were also created in this period. Multiple other species were engineered across the war's duration. The Old Ones were running a biological weapons program on a galactic scale, and the ethics of that program apparently didn't extend to detailed planning for what would happen to fully sentient, self-reproducing species once their specific military utility was exhausted. The moral contrast with the Old Ones' refusal of the Necrontyr is worth stating plainly. They declined to share immortality with a dying civilization, for whatever reasons the canon never records. Then, when the war turned against them, They manufactured fully sentient beings, equipped them with consciousness and the full capacity for suffering and joy, and deployed them as soldiers in someone else's conflict. They decided the Necrontyr hadn't earned the right to stop dying. Then they created lives specifically to be spent in combat. The passive cruelty of the Refusal and the active cruelty of the weapons program aren't morally equivalent categories, but both come from the same source: the assumption that the Old Ones had the right to decide which conscious beings' lives had value and how that value should be allocated. The warp was the dimension where the consequences of this logic would eventually come due. The immaterium runs parallel to real space, reflecting and amplifying the emotional states of conscious beings. Joy, grief, fear, rage, hope. All of it generates psychic energy that flows into the warp and is expressed back in forms ranging from benign to catastrophic, depending on the intensity and volume. The Old Ones were the galaxy's supreme masters of this dimension. They had built the webway specifically because they understood the warp's dangers well enough to want a bypass route. Their expertise wasn't incidental. It was the deepest understanding any civilization in galactic history had developed. A species that builds the webway to avoid the warp's dangers understands those dangers intimately. They had just engineered races of hyper-psychic beings and deployed them in a centuries-long apocalyptic war. The Eldari, designed to maximize psychic output, poured their emotional states directly into the warp in quantities without precedent in galactic history. Battle fury, terror, grief, the desperation of a species fighting for survival it hadn't chosen. All of it amplifying into the immaterium at a scale the warp structure couldn't absorb without consequence. The Krork generated their own psychic contribution. The Old Ones themselves fought through the immaterium as much as through real space. The carnage was total and sustained across what the lore describes as several centuries of uninterrupted conflict. The Chaos Gods, entities existing in the warp, feeding on psychic energy from living beings, are what expanded in that environment. The current canonical understanding is that these entities, or the seeds of them, existed in some form before the war in heaven. But the war's sustained psychic carnage, generated at scales without precedent in galactic history, fed whatever existed in the warp and amplified it into something far greater and more terrible than it had been. The Necrons are absent from this causal chain in this specific and important way. After biotransference, the Necrons had no presence in the warp. Their souls have been consumed in the process, stripping them of any psychic footprint entirely. Necrons didn't generate the emotional output that fed the Chaos Gods. They couldn't damage the immaterium by existing or fighting. The psychic amplification that permanently scarred the fundamental architecture of reality came exclusively from organic psychic participants. From the Eldari and the Krork and the Old Ones themselves, from beings who were in that war because the Old Ones had either engineered them for it or brought themselves there. The Old Ones' mastery of the warp made their responsibility here harder to dismiss, not easier. They of all beings in the galaxy had reason to understand what sustained hyperpsychic amplification at that scale would do to the immaterium. Whatever their intentions, the consequences were predictable from exactly the position of expertise they occupied. The Necrontyr had asked for a way to stop dying. The Old Ones, in the course of refusing them and then fighting back, had managed to permanently damage the fabric of reality. Szarekh bided his time. The biotransference process had embedded engrammatic command protocols in every Necron mind, granting Szarekh the unswerving loyalty of his subjects, a control mechanism the C'tan had designed as a leash to keep their army manageable. Szarekh recognized it for what it was. He wore his own version of those chains. He waited with the patience of a being who couldn't die until the Old Ones were defeated, until the C'tan were occupied with their victory, until the moment was right. Then he used the C'tan's own control infrastructure to coordinate a rebellion against those same gods. The Necrons turned on the C'tan with weapons specifically built to damage beings of pure energy. Tools they'd had to engineer covertly, without alerting their masters, while fighting the very war those masters were directing. The deceiver's own nature worked against his kind in this final phase. He had been spreading distrust among the C'tan throughout the conflict, manipulating star gods into consuming one another, fracturing their collective power from within, even as Sarekh's forces struck from without. The shattering didn't destroy the C'tan. Their fundamental nature made total destruction impossible, but it broke them into shards, fragments of their former power, captured in containment devices and stripped of the unified will that had made them galaxy-threatening. The trickster who had steered an entire civilization toward its doom was reduced to a prisoner of the hollow army he'd created. The Nightbringer, shattered. The Void Dragon, shattered. The Outsider, shattered and driven so deep into itself by what was done to it that it may never be anything but a fragment of fragment. All of them enslaved by the very beings they deceived into serving them. The war was over. The old ones were gone, driven to extinction or beyond the galaxy's edge. The C'tan were broken into manageable fragments. Szarekh had won. The warp was still in ruins. The psychic entities the destabilized Imperium had begun producing, the enslavers, creatures born of the same psychic chaos the war had generated, poured through weakened dimensional boundaries and devastated the organic species that had no defense against them. The Old One's own weapons had made the post-war galaxy lethal to the kind of life that had built those weapons. The Eldari survived by retreating into the webway, the same dimensional infrastructure the Old Ones had built and withheld from the Necrontyr, now serving as the one refuge from the consequences of the Old Ones' conflict. The Krork devolved without guidance, without purpose, their engineered aggression turning inward and outward without direction as the species they'd been built to fight were gone. Most other organic life didn't survive the immediate aftermath at all. The Necrons, soulless and warp invisible by accident of the theft done to them, were immune to the enslavers. The C'tan had consumed their souls to feed themselves. That absence, that specific emptiness at the center of Necron existence, had now become the one survival advantage the Necrontyr had left. Protection against a plague made possible by the same war the C'tan had orchestrated. They'd won every battle and inherited a galaxy that had nothing left to offer them. The Great Sleep followed. Szarekh ordered his people into tomb worlds, planet-wide mausoleums built into the crust of dead worlds scattered across the galaxy, to wait for conditions to improve. The plan had been for the tomb worlds to awaken in concert, the Necron dynasties rousing simultaneously when the galaxy was ready. Before departing, Szarekh released the command protocols that gave him direct authority over those dynasties, freeing his people from the last chains of control, surviving from the C'tan's original design. Then he left entirely, withdrawing into the outer void, exiling himself from the civilization he had condemned and rebuilt and broken again. He left alone. The Great Sleep would last approximately 60 million years. When the Necrons began waking in the 41st millennium, the tomb worlds had degraded unevenly, glitches and flaws in systems meant to last forever accumulating across geological timescales. Sarekh's release of the Central Command meant no coordinated awakening occurred. Dynasties rose in fragments and confusion. Many of their rulers further deteriorated by the long sleep into eccentricity or creeping madness. Some Necron nobles woke, still believing themselves to be flesh and blood, still holding vast, silent banquets for victories 60 million years old. Others had embraced the machine so completely during the long centuries that they'd abandoned any pretense of personhood and become pure weapons, the destroyer cults that even other Necrons regard with fear. The sleep that was meant to be a strategic withdrawal became a slow catastrophe of its own. And the galaxy they woke to was the Old One's full legacy in action. Every chaos incursion ripping through a human world in the 41st millennium traces back to the warp destabilization the Old One's weapons program caused. The Chaos Gods are the permanent legacy of a war fought with hyper-psychic biological weapons in the galaxy's most sensitive dimension. Khorne's endless wars, Nurgle's plague spreading across whole sectors, Tzeentch's manipulations threading through every power structure in known space, and Slaanesh, born from the psychic excess of the Eldari civilization the Old Ones had built, whose birth tore the Eye of Terror open at the heart of the galaxy and consumed the Eldari gods in the same catastrophic event. Every craft world drifting through the void is a delayed invoice from a design decision 60 million years old. The Eldari were created to feel everything with unnatural intensity. The Old Ones intended that as a military asset. The eventual bill was the near extinction of the most psychically powerful civilization in galactic history, and a wound in the fabric of space that hasn't healed. The orcs can't be eradicated. They spread spores across every world they touch, draw more of their kind into being through the act of fighting itself, and function as a self-sustaining ecological force because the Old Ones built them to be exactly that. Every imperial world crushed under a Wa, every civilization ground to nothing under the green tide, is the Old Ones' biology program running decades past its context, with no off switch and no one left alive who designed one. The Necrons had no part in any of this specific chain of consequence. No warp presence, no chaos contribution, no engineered species running loose and unstoppable through the stars. They watch from their tomb worlds a galaxy dying slowly by the compounding legacies of its first great civilization. Szarekh returned. He's fighting again in the 41st millennium, not for conquest, not to rebuild a Necrontyr empire that no longer has the people to fill it, but because he understands that a galaxy where all life is consumed has no future for anyone. He has aligned himself with other factions, including humanity, to address the Tyranid threat, which he regards as an existential danger requiring a response that crosses factional lines. The king who condemned his civilization to save it, now fighting to preserve the conditions under which salvation remains even theoretically possible, because he is the last being alive who remembers what was lost at the full scale it was lost, and he hasn't been able to stop working on the problem. The galaxy he's fighting to save is the Old One's legacy, the chaos gods corrupting it, the dying Eldari haunting its edges, the orcs spreading through its flesh like the cancers that once spread through the Necrontyr. Not one of these catastrophes was the Necrons' doing. Not one of them was inevitable. Every single one traces to a chain of decisions that began with an immortal civilization looking at a dying one and declining to help. And then, when the consequences of that refusal became a war, responding to that war in ways that permanently broke the dimension underlying all of reality. Szarekh was right about the Old Ones. Orikan was right about the Satan. Nobody listened to either of them. The galaxy has been paying for that silence every day for 60 million years and shows no sign of stopping. Subscribe for more stories like this.